My name is Brielle Stanton, I am 27 years old. I still remember the exact moment the ground shifted under everything I thought I understood about blood and loyalty. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the quiet private hillside enclave near Charlottesville where I had built a careful, independent life. I was alone in my home office overlooking the trees when the encrypted file arrived from an anonymous account. One short insider memo, 3 pages long, detailing covered-up money moves that had been draining a shared investment portfolio for the better part of 18 months. The signature trail and the authorization codes pointed straight at my older brother. If you have ever opened a document and felt your stomach drop while your hands stayed perfectly still, you already know the kind of silence that followed. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and whether you have ever been the one who found the proof no one else wanted to see. I read the memo twice. Then I read it a third time while the late light moved across the desk. Every transfer, every adjusted entry, every quiet reallocation had been framed as family liquidity management. My older brother had signed off on them. My father had countersigned. I had been listed as a passive beneficiary who was kept informed, yet I had never seen a single one of these records until that afternoon. The first call I made was not to either of them. I called Avery Shaw, the colleague I trusted most at the consulting firm where I worked as a strategic analyst for high-value property and investment clients in the region. Avery answered on the second ring. I kept my voice even and asked if she had ever reviewed the quarterly statements for the family hillside portfolio. There was a pause long enough for me to hear her chair creak. I thought those were closed to external eyes, she said. Why are you asking? I told her I had received a document that raised questions about authorization. Another pause. Then her tone shifted, cooler, more careful. Brielle, if you start pulling threads on family money, people are going to question where your loyalty sits. You know how this community works. Word travels faster than facts up here. That was the first time someone I respected looked at me and saw a potential problem instead of a professional who had simply found an anomaly. I ended the call politely and sat with the memo open on the screen. The numbers were not dramatic enough to scream fraud to a casual reader, but they were precise enough to show a pattern. Funds moved just under reporting thresholds. Dates clustered around family gatherings I had skipped because of work. Notes that used my name in the third person as if I had already agreed. That evening I drove the short winding road to the larger house my father still occupied higher on the ridge. I did not call ahead. When he opened the door he looked surprised but not alarmed. I handed him a printed copy of the first page and watched his face. He read it in silence. Then he folded the paper once and said, "Your older brother has been managing the portfolio. That is what oldest sons do. You have your own career. This does not concern you the way you think it does." I asked him why my name appeared on authorization summaries I had never signed. He set the paper on the side table and met my eyes with the calm expression he had used for years whenever something uncomfortable surfaced. Blood ties mean we handle things inside the family. You do not need to turn this into a formal inquiry. Your older brother has everything under control. It was the first time the ownership in the sentence landed harder than any raised voice could have. I left without raising my own. On the drive back down the hill I kept both hands on the wheel and forced my breathing to stay steady. The memo sat in the passenger seat like a living thing. The next morning I requested a full archive of the portfolio communications through the secure client portal I still had access to as a named party. The system returned partial records. Several threads had been marked internal only and restricted. I documented every restricted header, every missing attachment, every timestamp that did not line up. I created a clean folder on an encrypted drive and labeled it with a neutral project code so that even if someone looked over my shoulder they would see only ordinary work product. 2 days later my older brother appeared at my office unannounced. He closed the door, sat in the guest chair, and smiled the same easy smile he had used since we were teenagers. "Dad said you got some paperwork that confused you," he said. I can walk you through it. The moves were temporary. Liquidity for a development opportunity that did not pan out the way we hoped. Everything is being restored. I asked for the original authorizations bearing my signature. He leaned back and shook his head slowly. You were traveling when those decisions had to be made. Dad and I handled it the way family handles things. You have always been the one who preferred distance. That is fine. But distance does not give you the right to start questioning the people who kept the structure standing while you built your own name. The words were soft. The implication was not. I felt the familiar pressure that had followed me since childhood, the expectation that I would accept the explanation and stop asking. This time I did not. I told him I wanted every record restored to the shared archive within 48 hours. He stood, still smiling, and said he would look into it. He did not look into it. Instead, the following week I received a polite but pointed email from the firm's compliance officer noting that a client had expressed concern about potential divided loyalties within the team handling certain Hillside accounts. The client was not named, but the language tracked almost exactly with the warning Avery had given me. When I asked Avery about it in the hallway, she would not meet my eyes. I told you word travels, she said quietly. People are already asking why you are digging into family business on company time. I have to protect my own position. You understand that, right? I understood that the circle had begun to close. The same community that praised quiet competence was now treating my request for ordinary transparency as a disruption. I kept working. I kept documenting. I did not confront anyone else yet. I simply continued building the timeline of every covered-up transfer, every counter-signature, every note. That treated my consent as already given. On a rainy Thursday afternoon my father called. His voice carried the same measured calm. Your older brother is under pressure because of the questions you are raising, he said. This is not the time to create more friction. The portfolio will stabilize. You need to trust that. I asked him directly whether he had known about the pattern of transfers before the memo reached me. There was a long silence on the line. Then he said, some decisions are made to protect the whole, not the individual. You will understand that when you are older. I was 27. I had already been old enough to notice the gaps for years. I ended the call and sat in the gray light of my office until the rain stopped. The encrypted drive held 17 carefully organized files by then. Each one was another quiet proof that the blood ties I had been taught to honor had been used to mask something simpler and colder. I did not yet know how far the fallout would reach. I only knew that the first version of the story my older brother and my father preferred was already beginning to crack, and that once it cracked I would not be the one who tried to hold it together. The encrypted drive still held those 17 files when I returned to my desk the next morning, and the quiet resolve that had settled over me the night before had not faded. I opened the folder again and began the slower work of cross-checking every transfer date against the limited statements I could still access through the client portal. 3 days later the first formal complaint arrived. It came through the firm's internal ethics channel and named me as the source of disruptive inquiries into accounts that were privately managed. The language was careful, almost polite, yet the effect was immediate. My supervisor called me into a glass-walled conference room and asked whether I understood the optics of a team member questioning family-linked portfolios while still employed by the firm. I answered that I understood the difference between optics and documentation. He looked at me for a long moment and then said the firm would need to place a temporary hold on any of my work that touched Hillside investment clients until the matter was reviewed. I left the room with my badge still active but my calendar suddenly empty of the higher value meetings I had spent years earning. Avery Shaw passed me in the hallway and did not stop. Later that afternoon she sent a short message. I warned you. People are choosing sides. I have to stay on the side that keeps my projects intact. I did not reply. The secondary fracture had opened exactly where I had hoped it would not. That evening my older brother called. His voice carried none of the earlier easy smile. "You filed something internal," he said. "Do you have any idea what that does to the family's standing in this community?" Clients talk. Neighbors talk. Dad is already fielding questions he should not have to answer. I told him I had filed nothing public. I had only requested records that should have been available to any named party. He laughed once, short and humorless. "You requested them in a way that forced other people to notice. That is the same as filing. Fix this before it spreads any further." He hung up before I could answer. I sat with the phone in my hand and felt the familiar weight of being the one expected to absorb the discomfort so that everyone else could remain comfortable. This time the weight did not settle the same way. I opened a new document and began drafting a precise timeline of every restricted thread, every counter-signature, and every instance in which my consent had been assumed rather than obtained. The following week Weston Hale, a business partner who had collaborated with me on 2 earlier property analyses, asked to meet at a quiet coffee place halfway down the mountain. He arrived looking uncomfortable. "I received a call from someone connected to your family's portfolio," he said after the usual greetings. "They suggested it might be better if we paused any joint work until the internal questions settle. I do not want to lose the relationship with you, but I also cannot afford the association if this becomes louder." I thanked him for the honesty and ended the meeting cleanly. Another professional tie had loosened. I drove home along the winding road and watched the trees blur past the windows. The hillside enclave that had once felt like a place of earned quiet now felt like a place where silence was expected to protect certain people and expose others. My mother called 2 nights later. Her voice was soft, almost careful. "Your father is not sleeping well," she said. "Your older brother is under more strain than he shows. Can you not let this rest for a while?" Families survive by deciding which truths need air and which ones do not. I asked her whether she had seen the memo. She was quiet for several seconds. "I have seen enough to know that opening every closed door does not always bring peace," she answered. "Sometimes it only brings the kind of attention that cannot be taken back." I told her I was not seeking attention. I was seeking the records that already carried my name. She sighed the particular sigh that had followed difficult conversations for as long as I could remember and said she hoped I would reconsider before the cost grew larger than the principal. The cost continued to grow. A local contact named Fletcher Quinn, someone who had occasionally referred hillside clients to me, stopped returning my messages. When I finally reached him, he was brief. "Word is that you are the reason certain accounts are under review," he said. "I cannot afford to be linked to that right now." Nothing personal. Everything about it was personal. The circle of professional trust one had built independently of my family was shrinking in real time, and the force driving the shrinkage was the same blood tie that had been used to justify the covered-up transfers in the first place. I contacted Caleb Mercer, an attorney whose name had been given to me months earlier by a former colleague for precisely the kind of quiet documentation work I now needed. We met in his modest office on the edge of town. I placed the encrypted drive on his desk and walked him through the timeline without embellishment. He listened, took notes, and then looked up. "This is not yet a criminal matter on its face," he said carefully. "But the pattern of restricted access and assumed consent is enough to support a formal request for full accounting. If you want to proceed, we can send a measured letter requesting restoration of the complete record. It will not be friendly. It will also not be easy to ignore." I authorized the letter that same afternoon. 2 days after it was sent, my older brother appeared again, this time at my front door after dark. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood on the step and spoke in the low, controlled tone he used when he wanted the last word. "You involved an outside attorney. That crosses a line you do not get to uncross. Dad is prepared to handle the portfolio correction quietly if you withdraw the request. If you do not, the story that reaches the rest of this community will not be the one you think it is. People already believe you are the one creating the problem. Do not make it worse." I asked him one question. Did you ever intend for me to see the full record? He looked past me toward the dark trees. Some records are kept for the people who actually carry the weight of the family. You chose a different weight. Live with that choice. He left without waiting for a reply. I closed the door and leaned against it for a long moment, feeling the cool wood against my back. The memo that had arrived weeks earlier had been only the first fracture. Now the pressure was deliberate, coordinated, and aimed at isolating me from every professional and social connection that had once given me independent ground. The next morning I received a short message from Nora Eller, a mutual friend who had known both my older brother and me since college. She asked if we could talk. When we met, she looked tired. Your older brother has been telling people you are unstable about money because you never had to manage the larger responsibilities, she said. I do not know what is true, but the version spreading through the enclave is not flattering to you. I wanted you to hear it from someone who still cares what happens next. I thanked her for the warning and drove home in silence. The community standing I had spent years building through careful, competent work was being rewritten in real time by the same people who had used my name on documents I never approved. That night, I opened the encrypted drive one more time and added the new communications, the attorney letter, the sudden professional withdrawals. The file count had grown. The pattern had grown clearer. And somewhere in the middle of the quiet hillside dark I understood that the next step would not be another request. It would be a decision about how much of myself I was willing to keep offering to people who had already decided my silence was more valuable than my presence. I did not yet know that the admission I had been waiting for would come from the one person I still half expected to choose truth over protection. I only knew the ground under the old arrangement had finished shifting, and whatever came next would have to be built on whatever solid place I could still find for myself. The decision settled in the quiet of that hillside night and stayed with me through the following days as the pressure continued to tighten. I did not withdraw the attorney's letter. I did not answer the next 3 calls from my older brother. Instead, I waited for the formal response that Caleb Mercer had told me would eventually arrive. It came on a gray morning in the form of a short meeting requested by my father. We met at a neutral office space in town rather than any family property. He looked older than he had only weeks earlier. My older brother was not present at first. My father placed a thin folder on the table between us and spoke without preamble. I signed the authorizations, he said. I knew the transfers were being framed as temporary liquidity when they were not. I believed the structure would correct itself and that you would never need to see the full record. That was a deception I chose. I am telling you now because the letter has made further silence impossible. The admission landed without drama. It simply sat in the room between us, clear and irreversible. I asked him why he had protected the pattern for so long. He looked at the folder rather than at me. Because your older brother carried the visible weight of the portfolio and the community expectations that came with it. I told myself that protecting him was the same as protecting the family. I was wrong about what that protection cost you. My older brother entered a few minutes later. He had been waiting in the outer office. When he heard the substance of what had been said, his expression hardened into something colder than anger. You did not have to say any of that, he told our father. Then he turned to me. You wanted the truth. Now you have it. What exactly do you plan to do with it besides destroy the standing this family still has left in this place? I answered that I planned to require a complete and independent accounting of every transfer that had carried my name without my knowledge. I planned to remove myself from any future shared structure. And I planned to stop participating in the version of loyalty that required my silence as its price. He stared at me for a long moment. Then you are choosing to walk away from everything that ever gave you a place here. Do not expect the community to see you as the injured party. They will see the person who forced a private matter into the open and damaged the rest of us in the process. The meeting ended without agreement. Caleb Mercer sent the formal demand for full accounting the same day. Within a week, the professional consequences accelerated. Dana Whitfield, a long-term client whose hillside property analysis I had handled for nearly 3 years, called to say she was moving her work to another consultant. She was polite and regretful. She also made clear that the association had become uncomfortable after conversations circulating through the enclave. Theo Rankin, a local advisor who had occasionally shared referrals, sent a brief note ending our informal collaboration. The pattern was consistent. My community standing, once built on quiet competence, was being rewritten as the source of unnecessary disruption. Avery Shaw requested a final conversation in the firm parking lot. She kept her arms folded and her voice low. "I cannot continue any shared projects with you," she said. "The firm has made it clear that proximity to this situation carries risk. I warned you at the beginning. Loyalty has limits when careers are on the line." I thanked her for the directness and watched her walk back inside. Another tie severed cleanly. My mother reached out once more by phone. Her voice held the same careful softness as before. "Your father is trying to contain what can still be contained," she said. "Your older brother believes you have chosen spectacle over family. I am asking you one last time to consider how much of this needs to remain open." I told her that the openness had already been decided by the people who signed documents in my name and then restricted the record. I told her I would not reopen a conversation that required me to pretend the deception had not occurred. She was silent for a time and then said she hoped I would find some measure of peace with the distance I was creating. The call ended there. I moved out of the hillside enclave 6 weeks later. The decision was practical rather than dramatic. The lease on a smaller place farther down the valley came available, and I took it. I packed the encrypted drive, the printed timeline, and the few pieces of furniture that had always been mine. I left no forwarding details with the family. Caleb Mercer handled the final exchange of documents confirming that I would accept a clean financial separation and nothing further. No shared accounts. No future authorizations. No expectation of contact. My older brother sent one last message through an intermediary. It stated that the family considered the matter closed and that any further communication would be unwelcome. I did not reply. The boundary was mutual by then, though only one of us had chosen it for reasons of self-preservation rather than control. The months that followed were quieter than I had expected. Work continued, though the higher-value hillside clients did not return. New projects arrived more slowly and from farther away. I rebuilt a smaller professional circle that knew nothing of the family portfolio or the memo that had started everything. Evenings were spent in the new place with the trees at a greater distance and the silence no longer carrying the weight of expected loyalty. I did not receive apologies that changed the facts. I did not watch anyone lose the standing they had tried to protect at my expense. The community that had once included me simply adjusted to my absence and continued. What remained was the knowledge that I had stopped offering pieces of myself to a structure that required my silence in order to function. The blood ties that had masked the truth for so long no longer reached me. There are nights when the old version of belonging still flickers at the edge of memory, the version in which family meant protection instead of calculated omission. Those nights pass. I make tea. I review the ordinary work of the following day. I do not reopen the encrypted files. The decision to walk away did not restore what was taken and it did not punish anyone else. It only returned to me the right to decide what I would and would not carry. That is the only outcome I still claim. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever stood at the edge of a family system that asked you to stay silent in order to belong, would you cut contact the way I did? Or would you have tried one more time to force the truth into the open? 5 YouTube titles. My older brother covered money moves for years until I found the memo and walked away forever. My older brother and father hid the transfers, then watched my standing collapse in silence. My older brother called my questions disloyal until I chose distance over blood ties completely. My older brother used family loyalty to mask deception, and I finally set the boundary that ended us. My older brother forced me to choose between silence and self-respect, so I chose permanent distance. 3 descriptions. The insider memo arrived without warning and showed years of covered money moves authorized in my name without my knowledge. My older brother expected silence. My father admitted he had protected the pattern. What followed was the slow loss of every professional and community tie I had built, and the quiet decision to leave rather than keep performing loyalty that had never been returned. This is a fictional dramatized story created for entertainment purposes only. Names and details have been changed. In the end, I learned that actions prove real loyalty and that sometimes the strongest choice is simply to walk away and stay gone. What would you have done if the people who shared your blood asked you to ignore the proof? I spent weeks documenting every restricted record and every assumed signature while my older brother warned me that the community would turn against the person who forced the truth into the open. He was right about the cost. Clients stepped back. Colleagues chose safer ground. The hillside enclave that had once felt like home adjusted to my absence without ceremony. This is a fictional dramatized story created for entertainment purposes only. Names and details have been changed. The lesson that remained was strength and detachment and the fierce quiet independence that comes from refusing to carry someone else's deception. Would you have stayed and kept fighting or cut contact the way I eventually did? When my father finally admitted the deception had been deliberate, my older brother made it clear that any further demand for accountability would finish what little standing I had left. I made the demand anyway, and then I left. No dramatic reckoning followed. Only the long, ordinary work of building a smaller life farther from the people who had used blood ties to hide the truth. This is a fictional dramatized story created for entertainment purposes only. Names and details have been changed. If you love stories about broken trust and setting boundaries, this is for you. Watch how one woman chose herself and learned the hard way that some doors are meant to stay closed. 5 hooks. My older brother stood on my doorstep after dark and told me some records belong only to the people who carry the real weight of the family, then watched me lose every client who once trusted my name. I asked my older brother for the signatures that carried my name, and he answered that distance does not give me the right to question the structure he and my father kept standing. When the complaint about divided loyalties reached my firm, my older brother called to say I had forced private family business into the open and now the community would see me as the problem. My older brother listened to our father admit the deception and then told me I had chosen to destroy the standing the rest of us still had left in the only place that ever claimed us. I removed myself from every shared account while my older brother sent word through an intermediary that further contact would be unwelcome, and I never answered because the boundary had already become permanent.